For 16 years, Ethan lived without knowing the truth about his father, but a forgotten envelope in the attic revealed a secret that would change his life forever. Now, he embarks on a journey that could transform not only his destiny, but that of an entire empire. The Patek Philippe watch gleamed on Jonathan Reed's wrist as he circulated through the hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The golden shine reflected the gala event's lights, hypnotizing those present as much as his calculated smile and impeccably cut Italian suit. To everyone there, he was the personification of success, a titan of business, a ruthless visionary who transformed failing companies into lucrative empires. At his cocktail party, executives and celebrities vied for his attention. A well-known socialite laughed exaggeratedly at one of his jokes, while a senator discreetly slipped his business card into the magnate's pocket. Jonathan maintained his diplomatic smile. Years of practice had transformed him into a master of the art of superficial conversation. "Mr. Reed, Forbes magazine would like a statement on the recent acquisition of Tech Vision." A reporter approached, microphone in hand. "Tech Vision represents the future of technological innovation. Our vision is to expand its operations globally over the next 5 years," he responded automatically, the words flowing like honey. Each of his phrases was carefully calculated to make headlines the next day. Meanwhile, miles away in a small Midwest town, Ethan Parker finished his shift at the local diner. At 16, he divided his time between school and his part-time job. His hands still smelled of hamburgers when he caught the bus home, observing the familiar streets of his town through the foggy window. The simple house where he lived with his grandmother, Mrs. Rose, was at the end of a quiet street. The worn shingles and peeling paint contrasted with the well-tended gardens, Mrs. Rose's pride. Upon entering, he found his grandmother organizing old boxes in the attic. "Ethan, my boy, I'm glad you're here. Come help me up here," she called, her voice carrying that familiar tone of affection that always warmed his heart. The boy climbed the creaky stairs to the attic, where he found his grandmother surrounded by piles of dusty boxes. "What are you looking for, Grandma?" "Oh, just organizing some memories," she replied, but there was something in her voice, an almost imperceptible hesitation that Ethan immediately noticed. Years of living only with her had made him especially sensitive to her mood changes. Among the open boxes, yellow documents and old photographs told stories of a past that Ethan barely knew. His mother, Sarah, smiled in some photos, young, radiant, full of dreams. It was strange to see these images. She seemed so different from the woman who left when he was only 5 years old, leaving him in Mrs. Rose's care to seek a better life in another state. "Grandma, why has Mom never contacted us again?" asked Ethan, a question he had asked hundreds of times over the years. Mrs. Rose sighed, her wrinkled hands pausing over an old folder. "Your mother. She always wanted the best for you, Ethan. Sometimes people make difficult decisions thinking they're doing the right thing." Ethan nodded, already accustomed to vague answers about his past. But something that night was different. Maybe it was the tiredness in his grandmother's eyes, or the way her hands trembled slightly as she handled the old documents. "Ethan," she began, her voice more serious than usual, "I think it's time you knew some things." The young man's heart raced. For years he had felt that there were secrets in his story, parts of the puzzle that never quite fit together. Why did his mother really leave? Why had he never met his father? Why did his grandmother sometimes observe him with a mixture of concern and guilt? Mrs. Rose pulled out a yellowed envelope from inside one of the folders. The paper was worn at the folds, as if it had been opened and closed countless times over the years. "This belonged to your mother. She made me promise to only give it to you when I thought you were ready." Ethan took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, he found official documents and a handwritten letter. His eyes ran across the page, absorbing each word as if they were drops of water in the desert. The more he read, the more his world seemed to spin. This can't be true," he muttered, the words barely leaving his dry mouth. The document in his hands was a birth certificate. On it, besides his mother's name, there was another name that made his heart stop for a moment. Jonathan Reed. "Your father?" Mrs. Rose confirmed softly. is one of the richest men in America. Ethan felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. All the stories his grandmother had told about his father being a young worker who had left before his birth, were they all lies? Why? Was all he could ask, his voice choked with emotion. Your mother met Jonathan when he was just starting his company. It was an intense but brief romance. When she discovered she was pregnant... Mrs. Rose paused, carefully choosing her words. He was already at another level, about to close important deals. He offered money, a lot of money, for your mother to keep everything secret. The words hit Ethan like successive waves. Each revelation brought with it more questions, more pain, more confusion. All this time, while he worked in a diner to help. With household expenses, his biological father was accumulating fortunes. Sarah initially refused the money, continued Mrs. Rose, but the pressures kept increasing. Lawyers veiled threats, promises that you would have a better life if she agreed to stay away. Your mother ended up agreeing to leave, thinking it would be best for you. Ethan looked at his own hands, calloused from work at the diner. How many times had he dreamed about his father? How many stories had he created in his mind about who he would be, where he would be? Reality now revealed itself to be much crueler than any scenario he could have imagined. And why tell me this now? He asked, his voice firmer, the initial surprise giving way to growing determination. Because you have the right to know who you are, replied Mrs. Rose, and because I saw your father on television yesterday announcing another of his business conquests. He's more powerful than ever, Ethan. But power isn't everything in life. Ethan slowly stood up, still holding the documents. Through the small attic window, he could see the city lights beginning to come on in the falling night. His world had completely changed in a matter of minutes, but one thing was clear. He needed to know the whole truth. If I'm going to find him, he declared, his voice surprisingly calm. Ethan, Mrs. Rose began, concern evident in her voice. Not to ask for money, he interrupted her, but to understand, to know why he chose his empire instead of his own son, to look into the eyes of the man who preferred to pretend I didn't exist. That night, while Jonathan Reed toasted to success in New York, his unknown son began to plan a journey that would change both their lives forever. The gold watch on the magnate's wrist continued to shine, oblivious to the fact that the time of hidden truths was coming to an end. The following morning dawned with a different determination on Ethan's face. Sitting at the kitchen table, he watched his grandmother prepare coffee while he navigated on his old cell phone, researching everything he could about Jonathan Reed. Each new discovery was like a piece of a puzzle he never knew he needed to assemble. "Grandma, did you know he started by selling used computers?" commented Ethan, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Now he owns the largest technology company in North America." Mrs. Rose placed a cup of coffee with milk in front of her grandson, her eyes revealing a mixture of concern and resignation. "Ethan, I know you're excited, but you need to think carefully about what you intend to do." "I've already thought about it, Grandma. I spent the whole night thinking," he replied, finally looking away from his phone. "I don't want his money. I just want answers." In his modest room, Ethan had created a small mural with news clippings about Jonathan Reed. The magnate appeared in elegant photos, always impeccable in his expensive suits, always surrounded by important people. In one of the most recent images, he was cutting the ribbon at the inauguration of a new research center in Boston. "Boston," muttered Ethan, an idea beginning to form in his mind. That's where his company headquarters is. During his break, at the diner that day, Ethan did more research. He discovered that Jonathan Reed would be the keynote speaker at a technology conference in the Massachusetts capital next week. The ticket cost more than his monthly salary, but he had some savings, money he had been saving to take a technical course. Olivia, his co-worker and best friend since childhood, noticed his distraction during the shift. "What's up, Ethan? You look like you've seen a ghost." For a moment, he considered telling her everything. Olivia had always been his safe harbor, the person with whom he shared all his secrets. But this truth seemed too big, too heavy to share so soon. "It's complicated," was all he could say. "Complicated is you almost putting ketchup in the customer's milkshake," she joked, trying to cheer him up. "Want to talk after the shift?" Ethan nodded, realizing he would need help for what he was planning to do. When they finished their shift, the two went to the central square of the town, their usual place for important conversations. "Olivia," he began, taking a deep breath, "I found out who my father is." The words came out like an avalanche after that. Ethan told her everything, the documents found in the attic, the truth about his mother, who Jonathan Reed really was. Olivia listened to everything in silence, her eyes widening more and more. "Oh my God, Ethan," she exclaimed when he finished. "It's like those soap opera stories, only real." "Yeah," he gave a sad smile. "And you know what's crazier? He's going to be in Boston next week." Olivia immediately understood where he was going with this. "No way, Ethan. You're not planning to go there, are you?" "I need to do this, Olivia. I need to look him in the eye, understand why he chose to pretend I didn't exist all these years." "And Mrs. Rose? Does she know about your plans?" Ethan shook his head. "Not yet, but I'll tell her. I can't let this opportunity pass." Meanwhile, in Boston, Jonathan Reed was conducting another board meeting in his office on the top floor of the impressive Reed Tech building. The panoramic view of the city served as a backdrop as he presented the latest financial results. "Our international expansion is progressing as planned," he declared, his voice conveying the usual confidence. "The acquisitions in Europe." A notification on his cell phone briefly interrupted his concentration. It was from his personal assistant, Jessica. "Important call from your former lawyer, Ms. Samantha Davis. She insists on speaking with you urgently." Jonathan frowned for an almost imperceptible moment before turning his attention back to the meeting. Samantha Davis was a name he hadn't heard in years, and one that reminded him of a past he preferred to keep buried. After the meeting, alone, in his office, he returned the call. "Jonathan," Samantha's voice sounded tense on the other end of the line. "We need to talk about Sarah Parker." The name hit Jonathan like a punch to the stomach. 16 years had passed, but that name still had the power to destabilize him. "What about her?" he asked, his voice controlled. "It's not about her exactly, it's about her son, your son." Jonathan stood up from his chair, walking to the window. Down below, Boston stretched out infinitely, a city of infinite possibilities and infinite secrets. "I thought we had resolved this issue years ago," he said coldly. "Things have changed, Jonathan. The boy found out about you, and from what my sources have informed me, he's determined to find you." Jonathan felt control slipping through his fingers. For years he had built his life like one builds a fortress, each brick carefully placed, each weakness systematically eliminated. Now a 16-year-old boy threatened to make it all crumble. "Stop this," he ordered. "It's not that simple," replied Samantha. "He has rights, and more importantly, he has proof. If this becomes public—" "Take care of it," interrupted Jonathan. "Use the necessary resources, but keep him away. I have a company to run and shareholders to satisfy. I can't afford to deal with ghosts from the past right now." After hanging up, Jonathan remained looking out the window for a long time. In the reflection of the glass, he saw his own face, the deeper expression lines, the grey hair at the temples, the eyes that had seen and done things he wasn't proud of. On his wrist, the gold watch continued its relentless ticking, reminding him that time, this resource he always thought he could control, was about to collect its debts. Back in the small, Midwest town, Ethan finally mustered the courage to tell his grandmother about his plans. "Mrs. Rose listened in silence, her hands busy peeling oranges, a habit she had whenever she was nervous. "I can't stop you," she said finally. "You're almost a man now. But promise me you'll be careful. Jonathan Reed isn't an ordinary man, Ethan. He has enough power to make things happen his way. I know, Grandma, but I also know that he can't run forever. Everyone has to face the truth sooner or later." That night, as he packed a small backpack with his things, Ethan found an old photo of his mother. In it, Sarah smiled, young and hopeful, not knowing that her choices would shape the destiny of so many people. He tucked the photo in his pocket, a reminder of what was at stake. In Boston, Jonathan Reed finally left his office, entering his armored Mercedes. In the back seat, he opened his tablet to review his speech for next week's conference. It was a speech about innovation, about how the choices of the present shape the future. How ironic, he thought, that his past would choose precisely this moment to knock on his door. The driver started the car, and the city lights began to slide past the window. Somewhere, a 16-year-old boy was preparing for a journey that would change their lives forever. The clock continued its inexorable movement, marking the time until the inevitable meeting between father and son. The bus cut through the darkness of the early morning as Ethan watched the distant lights through the window. His backpack, with just the essentials, rested on the seat beside him. In his pocket, the money saved during months of work at the diner, and the ticket for the technology conference he had managed to buy online. His entry into Jonathan Reed's world. Mrs. Rose had insisted on giving him her monthly savings despite her grandson's protests. "It's for emergencies," she said, hiding her tears as she hugged him at the bus station. "Boston isn't like our town, Ethan. Promise you'll call every day." Olivia was also there to say goodbye, handing him a homemade sandwich and a small envelope. "Only open it when you get there," she whispered, hugging him tightly. "And don't do anything stupid, you hear?" Now, as the bus approached the biggest city he had ever seen, Ethan felt the weight of his decisions. He opened Olivia's envelope, finding an old postcard of Boston and a note. "For when you feel lost, remember there are people here rooting for you. P.S. I saved your spot at the diner." The first view of Boston through the bus window was impressive. The skyscrapers seemed to touch the clouds, and the intense movement of people and vehicles made his town seem like a village in comparison. Ethan checked once again the address of the cheap hostel he had booked. It was a few blocks from the convention center where the conference would take place. Meanwhile, in the office of Reed Tech, Jonathan was receiving a detailed report on Ethan's movements. His security team had tracked the purchase of the ticket for the conference. "The boy is persistent," commented Jessica, his assistant, while organizing the day's schedule. "He managed to get a ticket even with the high price." Jonathan swiveled his leather chair facing the city through the mirrored windows. "Increase the security of the event. I want all accesses monitored, and cancel that ticket." "Sir," Jessica hesitated. "Technically, we can't cancel without a valid justification. This could draw unnecessary attention." Jonathan frowned, irritated by the obstacles that were arising. His empire was at a crucial moment. The merger with a European tech giant was about to be announced. The stock numbers had never been so favorable. He couldn't allow a teenager from the Midwest to threaten all of this. "Schedule a meeting with Samantha Davis for tonight," he ordered, "and prepare the helicopter for tomorrow. I'll personally supervise the conference preparations." At the hostel, Ethan was organizing his few clothes in the small shared wardrobe. His roommate was an Australian backpacker who barely stayed in the place, which gave him some privacy to organize his thoughts and strategies. He decided to explore the area, to scout the territory. The convention center was an imposing building with glass facades that reflected the Boston sky. Groups of well-dressed people were entering and exiting, speaking in different languages, carrying the latest laptops and tablets. "Excuse me," he approached one of the security guards. "The Tech Future conference starts tomorrow, right?" The man examined him with a suspicious look. "Yes, but only for credentialed people. Do you have a ticket?" Ethan showed the QR code on his cell phone, feeling a twinge of pride for having managed to be there, even if still on the outside. Back at the hostel, he called his grandmother, as promised. "Everything's fine, Grandma. Boston is different, bigger than I imagined." "Ethan," Mrs. Rose's voice sounded worried, "I received a visit today, a lawyer, Ms. Samantha Davis. She asked many questions about you." Ethan's heart raced. So Jonathan already knew about his coming. Was he trying to stop him? "What exactly did she want to know, Grandma?" "Your plans, where you went. She offered money, Ethan. A lot of money for me to convince you to come back." Ethan felt a mixture of anger and determination growing in his chest. "And what did you say?" "I said that you're old enough to make your own decisions, and that some things are priceless." That night, Ethan could barely sleep. From the hostel window, he could see the lights of offices still on in the skyscrapers. Somewhere in that city, Jonathan Reed was also awake, moving his pieces on the board. On the rooftop of the Ritz-Carlton, Jonathan was dining with Samantha Davis, his former lawyer. The panoramic view of Boston served as a backdrop for a tense conversation. "The grandmother won't cooperate," Samantha informed, sipping her wine. "She has an admirable dignity, I must admit." "Everyone has a price," retorted Jonathan, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "Not everyone, Jonathan, and that might be exactly the problem. The boy doesn't seem interested in money. He wants something you never knew how to give: attention." Jonathan put down his cutlery, his eyes fixed on the city below. "I built all of this from scratch, Samantha. Every decision I made was calculated. Every sacrifice was necessary. I can't allow a mistake from the past to destroy everything now." "Mistake from the past?" Samantha laughed humorlessly. "We're talking about your son, Jonathan, your flesh and blood. Have you ever thought that maybe it's time to face this truth?" "The truth," Jonathan responded coldly, "is that I have a company to run and shareholders to satisfy. Tomorrow's conference needs to be perfect. The merger announcement can't be overshadowed by family drama." Samantha observed him for a moment, recalling the ambitious young man she had met decades ago. "You know what impresses me the most, Jonathan? How someone so brilliant in business can be so blind to what really matters." Jonathan stopped, turning to face her. "What do you want, Samantha? Why are you so involved in this?" "Because 16 years ago I helped you make a mistake, and unlike you, I learned that some mistakes need to be corrected before it's too late." In the main hall, Ethan was watching the big screens announcing the schedule. Jonathan Reed's lecture, "Innovation and Future, the New Era of Technology," would be the highlight of the day, scheduled for 2 p.m. in the main auditorium. His cell phone vibrated with a message from Mrs. Rose. "God protect you, my boy. Whatever the outcome, we're with you." The hours dragged on as if they were days. Ethan attended some smaller lectures, trying to absorb the environment, study the movement. He observed how security was positioned, how people moved between spaces. During one of the breaks, he managed to overhear 2 executives commenting on the cocktail party that would happen after the main lecture. Finally, 15 minutes before 2 p.m., the main auditorium began to fill. Ethan chose a strategic spot, neither too close nor too far from the stage. His heart beat faster and faster as the lights began to dim. A soft voice announced on the sound system, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the CEO and founder of Reed Tech, Jonathan Reed." The man who took the stage was exactly like in the photos, but somehow more real, more human. His impeccable suit, his confident walk, his studied smile, all part of a carefully constructed image. Ethan felt something strange in his chest as he saw, for the first time in his life, the man who was his father. Jonathan began his presentation with his usual confidence. He spoke about innovation, about how his company was shaping the future of technology. The slides passed with millimetric precision, each word calculated to cause maximum impact. "The future," he said, his voice amplified by the sound system, "is built with the decisions we make today." Ethan felt these words as a cruel irony. What decisions had his father made 16 years ago? What future had he chosen to build or destroy? That's when it happened. During a pause to drink water, Jonathan looked directly in his direction. For a brief moment, their gazes met across the packed auditorium. Ethan saw the almost imperceptible freeze in his posture, the microsecond of hesitation in his movements. He knew. In that instant, father and son recognized each other, even though they had never met before. Jonathan recovered quickly, continuing his presentation as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. His voice, previously so confident, carried an almost imperceptible note of tension. Ethan remained in his place, absorbing every detail. He noticed how Jonathan gestured with his right hand when emphasizing important points, how his posture subtly changed when talking about the company's future, how his gold watch caught the light from the spotlights. At the end of the lecture, the applause was deafening. Jonathan thanked with a professional smile and was quickly surrounded by security guards who escorted him off the stage. Ethan stood up, determined not to lose this opportunity, but felt a hand on his shoulder. "Ethan Parker." It was an elegant, middle-aged woman. "I'm Samantha Davis. We need to talk." "Not now," he replied, trying to break free. "I need to—" "He won't talk to you here. Samantha interrupted him softly. "But I can help you get what you want. You just need to listen to me first." Ethan hesitated, torn between following his impulse and listening to the woman who seemed to know so much about his story. Up front, Jonathan was disappearing through a side door, taking with him the answers that Ethan so desperately sought. 5 minutes, he finally agreed. "That's all I'll give you." As the auditorium emptied, father and son followed different paths, one fleeing from his past, the other running towards it. The watch on Jonathan's wrist continued its constant movement, marking the time until the true confrontation that they both knew was inevitable. The convention center's cafe was almost empty when Samantha Davis ordered 2 espressos. Ethan observed the woman with a mixture of curiosity and distrust, aware that every minute he spent there was another minute Jonathan gained to distance himself. "You have your mother's determination," commented Samantha, studying the young man's face. "Sarah also never gave up easily." "You knew my mother?" Ethan leaned forward, suddenly more interested. "I knew all the characters in this story, Ethan, including the version of Jonathan Reed that existed before money and power went to his head." On the other side of the convention center, Jonathan took refuge in his VIP room, loosening his tie with slightly trembling fingers. Jessica served him a whiskey while updating the situation. "The press is waiting in the main hall for the merger announcement," she informed. "The European executives—" "How did he get in?" interrupted Jonathan, his voice laden with contained anger. "Security shouldn't have. He had a valid ticket, sir. We couldn't prevent his entry without causing a scene." Jonathan swirled the glass in his hands, watching the amber liquid dance. The brief moment when his eyes met Ethan's in the auditorium had awakened something he thought he had buried long ago. Guilt, perhaps. Or was it fear? Back at the cafe, Samantha continued her story. Jonathan and Sarah met when he was just starting out. Reed Tech was nothing more than a small computer repair company in a rented office. "And what changed?" asked Ethan, absorbing every word. "An opportunity. A government contract that could change everything." Jonathan was about to close the deal when Sarah discovered she was pregnant. Ethan felt a lump in his throat, and he chose the contract. "It wasn't that simple," Samantha sighed. "The investors made it clear that a personal scandal could ruin everything. Jonathan convinced himself that he was protecting everyone, including you and your mother, by keeping his distance." "Protecting?" Ethan laughed humorlessly. "Is that what he calls abandonment nowadays?" Meanwhile, Jonathan was conducting a tense meeting with his crisis team. The merger announcement was scheduled for an hour from now, and journalists were already starting to position themselves. "The Europeans are concerned," his vice president informed. "Rumors have surfaced about a possible family scandal." Jonathan slammed his fist on the table. "Who talked?" "Social media, sir. Someone posted a photo of you next to an old one of Sarah Parker. Speculations began." At the cafe, Samantha showed Ethan her cell phone. The viral photo showed a young Jonathan next to his mother, both smiling in front of a small computer store. The date in the corner of the image, 2008. "This photo," said Ethan, his voice trembling, "was taken the day they met?" "On the day he promised they would build a future together," confirmed Samantha. "Sarah kept this photo for years. She believed that one day he would come back, that he would understand that some things are more important than money." "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because you need to understand that the man you saw on stage today is not the same as the one in the photo. Power changes people, Ethan. But sometimes we just need a reminder of who we were to find our way back." In the VIP corridor, Jonathan paced back and forth, his gold watch weighing more heavily than ever on his wrist. News of the viral photo had triggered a storm of messages from advisors, shareholders, and journalists. "The Europeans want to postpone the announcement," Jessica informed. "They need guarantees that there won't be any unpleasant surprises." "We can't postpone." Jonathan ran his hands over his face, his facade of control beginning to crack. "The entire market is waiting for this announcement. The stocks are already reacting to the expectation." His cell phone vibrated with a message from Samantha. "He's with me at the cafe. It's time to face your ghosts, Jonathan." At the cafe, Ethan finished his espresso, digesting everything he had discovered. "Why did you decide to help me now after so long?" Samantha smiled sadly. "Because I've spent years watching Jonathan build an empire at the cost of his humanity. Maybe you're his last chance to remember who he was before he became just a logo on a skyscraper." Ethan's cell phone vibrated with a message from Mrs. Rose. "Son, social media is in an uproar. Are you okay?" Before he could respond, he saw Jessica, Jonathan's assistant, approaching their table. "Mr. Parker," she said formally, "Mr. Reed would like to speak with you. In private." Ethan felt his heart race. This was it, the moment he had imagined throughout the entire trip to Boston. "Where?" he asked, surprising himself with the firmness of his own voice. "In the VIP room in 10 minutes, replied Jessica, handing him an access badge. "Maximum security, no cell phones or recorders." Samantha touched Ethan's arm before he stood up. "Remember, you're not the only one scared in this story." On the way to the VIP room, Ethan stopped in front of a mirror in the corridor. The reflection showed a young man trying to look older in his hastily bought clothes, but his eyes revealed a determination that no expensive suit could buy. Jonathan watched the city through the window of his room, the whiskey glass still untouched, on his desk. The watch on his wrist marked each second that brought him closer to the meeting he had avoided for 16 years. When the door opened, father and son finally met face to face. The silence that followed carried the weight of 16 years of absence, 16 years of unanswered questions, 16 years of a story that finally needed to be told. The gold watch continued its relentless movement, marking the beginning of a conversation that would forever change both their lives. Outside, Boston continued its frenetic rhythm, oblivious to the drama unfolding on the top floor of the convention center, where an empire built on secrets was beginning to show its first cracks. The silence in the VIP room was almost palpable. Jonathan remained standing by the window, his reflection overlapping with the view of the city below. Ethan, standing near the door, studied every detail of the man who was his father. The precise cut of the suit, the grey hair at the temples, the lines of expression that business magazines never showed. "You have her eyes," Jonathan finally said, turning to face his son. His voice, normally so firm in corporate presentations, carried an almost imperceptible tremor. "Is that all you have to say to me after 16 years?" replied Ethan, surprised by the calmness in his own voice. Jonathan walked to his desk, a movement that seemed more like an attempt to buy time than a real necessity. His fingers unconsciously brushed the gold watch on his wrist, a nervous tick that Ethan immediately noticed. "What do you want, Ethan?" asked Jonathan, trying to regain control of the situation as he did in his business meetings. "The truth," replied the young man, taking a step forward. "Not what Samantha told me, not what's circulating on social media. I want to hear from you why you chose to pretend I didn't exist." Jonathan sat in his leather chair, gesturing for Ethan to occupy the chair in front of him. It was a familiar dynamic for him, the powerful executive in his territory, controlling the conversation. But Ethan remained standing. "Things were different back then," Jonathan began, rehearsing the speech he had prepared. "The company was at a crucial moment." "No," interrupted Ethan, his voice firm. "Don't give me a corporate speech. 16 years of absence deserve more than prepared phrases." The young man took out of his pocket the old photo that had gone viral. Jonathan and Sarah smiling in front of the small computer store. He placed it on the tempered glass table. "This man in the photo," said Ethan, pointing to the young Jonathan. "What would he say if he knew what you've become?" Jonathan picked up the photograph with hands that now visibly trembled. For a moment, his mask of controlled CEO cracked, revealing something more vulnerable underneath. "Your mother and I, we were young, we had different dreams." "Don't diminish what you had," Ethan cut in. "Samantha showed me the letters, the emails. You loved her. You loved the idea of having a family. What changed?" Jonathan stood up abruptly, walking to the bar in the corner of the room. He poured himself water instead of the whiskey his body craved. "You think it was easy?" His voice had a defensive tone. "I had investors breathing down my neck, $1 million contract depending on my total dedication. If the market knew I had a child out of wedlock." "So you chose your precious market," concluded Ethan, bitterness tinging his words. "I chose to give you and your mother a comfortable life. The money I sent—" "Money?" Ethan laughed humorlessly. "Is that how you measure people's worth? In how many zeros fit in the bank account?" The door to the room opened and Jessica entered hurriedly. "Mr. Reed, the Europeans are waiting in the auditorium. The merger announcement." "Not now, Jessica." Jonathan cut her off with a sharpness that made his assistant recoil. "Go," said Ethan. "Your empire needs you. It always has, hasn't it?" But Jonathan didn't move. For the first time in years, the powerful CEO of Reed Tech seemed truly lost. "Do you have any idea," he began, his voice lower, "how many times I thought about looking for you? How many times I drove by your town? But you never stopped," Ethan completed. "You never had the courage to get out of your imported car and knock on our door. It wasn't that simple." "Yes, it was," exploded Ethan, years of hurt overflowing in his words. "It was just about being human, being a father. When was the last time you did something without calculating the risks and benefits?" Jonathan's cell phone vibrated insistently. Messages from shareholders, the legal team, the European partners. The empire he had built was waiting for its commander. But for the first time, the weight of the gold watch on his wrist seemed to suffocate him. "You know what's most ironic?" continued Ethan, his voice now laden with deep sadness. "I grew up imagining 1,000 reasons for your absence. I invented heroic stories, tragedies, insurmountable impediments. The reality is much worse. You simply chose not to be my father." Jonathan sat down again, the photo still in his hands. On the faded paper, his young and hopeful smile seemed to accuse him. "When your mother told me about the pregnancy," he said slowly, as if the words were hard to come out, "I was happy, truly happy. We planned everything, where we would live, how the baby's room would be. I was going to transform the store into a larger office with space for a crib in the corner." "What happened?" asked Ethan, his voice softer now. "Fear happened. The government contract was my big chance, but the investors made it clear that any personal scandal would be fatal. I started postponing decisions, just until closing the contract, just until the company stabilized, just until the next quarter." And then 16 years passed," Ethan completed. Silence returned to fill the room, but it was different now, less hostile, more laden with a shared sadness. "When I saw you in the auditorium today," said Jonathan, "for a moment I went back to that computer store. I saw your smile, just like hers, and for the first time in years, all my achievements seemed empty." The cell phone vibrated again. Jessica cracked open the door, her expression urgent. The world outside continued to spin, demanding the presence of the great Jonathan Reed. "You still have choices to make," said Ethan, walking towards the door. "You always do. The difference is that now you can't say you didn't know the consequences." Before leaving, he turned one last time. "I'll be at the cafe until the end of the afternoon. This time the decision is yours." Jonathan was left alone in the room, the old photo in one hand and the vibrating cell phone in the other. In the window glass, his reflection mingled with the lights of Boston, a city that never stops, that doesn't wait for anyone. But for the first time in 16 years, the most powerful man in the American tech market felt that maybe, just maybe, there was something more important than empires and mergers. The convention center's cafe had emptied almost completely. Ethan sat at a corner table, an untouched cup of coffee in front of him. Through the large glass panels, he could see executives and journalists moving hurriedly, all converging on the main auditorium where the big merger would be announced. His cell phone vibrated with a message from Olivia. "Saw the news. Are you okay? Want me to catch a bus to Boston right now?" A weak smile appeared on his lips as he replied, "I'm okay. Just processing a lot." In the bathroom of the VIP sector, Jonathan Reed splashed water on his face, staring at his reflection in the mirror. Ethan's words echoed in his mind. "You simply chose not to be my father." Jessica waited outside, probably reorganizing his entire schedule to deal with the crisis that was forming. "Sir?" She knocked softly on the door. "The Europeans are getting impatient, and the press office needs a statement about the situation." Jonathan adjusted his tie, an automatic gesture that had given him confidence for years. But today, not even his Italian suit seemed capable of protecting him from the whirlwind of emotions he was facing. "Give me 10 minutes," he responded, his voice hoarse. At the cafe, Samantha Davis joined Ethan, bringing 2 pieces of apple pie. "I thought you needed something sweet after so much intensity." "Why do I have the impression that you planned all this?" asked Ethan, poking at the pie with his fork. "Plan?" Samantha smiled. "Let's say I merely created the conditions for the truth to come out. The rest, well, the rest was you and your father." In the corridor leading to the main auditorium, Jonathan walked slowly against his always hurried nature. Jessica followed at his side, updating him on the situation. "The press is already speculating about postponing the merger. The stocks have started to fluctuate. The Europeans—" "Jessica," Jonathan interrupted, suddenly stopping. "Do you have children?" The assistant, caught off guard by the personal question, hesitated for a moment. "2 girls, sir." "And have you ever missed an important event of theirs because of work?" "Several times," she admitted, her voice lowering. "My eldest's ballet recital was last week. I was in Dubai, closing that contract." Jonathan looked at his gold watch, the symbol of all his success, of all his choices. "And was it worth it?" Jessica didn't answer, but her eyes filled with unshed tears. At the cafe, Ethan received a call from Mrs. Rose. "My boy, something's playing on television. Your father." Before she could continue, a buzz spread through the convention center. On the big screens scattered around the place, Jonathan Reed's image appeared live on the stage of the main auditorium. But something was different. The man who always presented himself with unshakable confidence seemed vulnerable. His face, normally marked by a studied smile, showed clear signs of emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice slightly trembling, "over the last 20 years I've built a company based on innovation and vision for the future. Today I was scheduled to announce another step in this journey, the largest merger in the tech sector in North America." The auditorium was in complete silence. At the cafe, Ethan approached one of the big screens, his heart beating fast. "But today is also the day I need to acknowledge that, in my pursuit of business success, I made mistakes that no million-dollar contract can justify." Murmurs began to spread through the auditorium. Jessica, backstage, watched open-mouthed as her boss completely deviated from the prepared speech. 16 years ago, Jonathan continued, his voice gaining firmness, "I made a choice that has haunted me every day since then. I chose professional success over what really mattered." At the cafe, Ethan felt Samantha gently touch his shoulder. His eyes were fixed on the screen, unable to believe what was happening. "Today, my son came to hold me accountable for that choice." Jonathan removed the gold watch from his wrist as he spoke. "And for the first time in 16 years, I truly looked at the man I've become." The buzz in the auditorium increased. Camera, flashes fired frantically. Backstage, European executives conversed agitatedly on their phones. "The merger we were to announce today is temporarily suspended," declared Jonathan, provoking a wave of surprised exclamations. "There are more important decisions that need to be made first. Decisions that should have been made long ago." Ethan felt his legs weaken. Samantha guided him to a nearby chair, her own eyes misty. "To my son who had the courage I lacked all these years." Jonathan looked directly at the camera, as if he could see Ethan through it. "If you're still willing to listen to me, I'm ready to try to fix what I broke." The silence that followed was deafening. On the big screens, Jonathan's image remained, his last words hanging in the air like a promise. The gold watch, symbol of his empire, lay forgotten on the podium. At the cafe, Ethan stared at the screen, silent tears running down his face. His cell phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Messages from Mrs. Rose, from Olivia, from people he didn't even know. But at that moment, all he could hear was the echo of his father's words he had waited 16 years to hear. Samantha, at his side, smiled softly. "Sometimes," she said, "even the most powerful empires need to take a step back, so their emperors can take a step forward." Outside, Boston continued its frenetic rhythm, but inside the convention center, time seemed to have stopped, marking the moment when the most powerful man in the American tech market chose to be simply a father. The chaos that followed Jonathan Reed's pronouncement was immediate. The convention center transformed into an agitated beehive, with journalists running in all directions, executives making frantic calls, and security guards trying to maintain some order amidst the confusion. At the cafe, Ethan remained seated, still processing what had happened. His cell phone continued vibrating incessantly. Messages, calls, social media notifications. The virtual world was in an uproar over the story of the billionaire CEO and his secret son. "I think you broke the internet," joked Samantha, trying to lighten the tension as she showed the headlines already popping up on all news sites. Jonathan Reed suspends mega merger for son, the secret heir of Reed Tech. Tech, empire shaken by family drama. "So I didn't want this," muttered Ethan, running his hands over his face. "I didn't want to destroy his company." "Sometimes we need to break something to rebuild it more solidly," replied Samantha, her tone soft. "Your father finally understood that." In the auditorium's green room, Jonathan faced the immediate consequences of his decision. Jessica tried to organize the chaos, while a line of people demanded explanations. Lawyers, shareholders, European executives, press officers. "The Europeans are threatening to sue for breach of contract," one of the lawyers informed. "The company's stock has already fallen 12% since your announcement." Jonathan, for the first time in his career, seemed completely oblivious to the numbers. His eyes were fixed on the gold watch he had left on the podium, symbol of a power that now seemed so empty. "Jessica," he called, ignoring the executive's protests, "where is my son?" "At the cafe, sir," she replied, a small smile appearing on her lips. "Do you want me to—" "No," Jonathan interrupted, standing up. "Some things we need to do personally." When Jonathan entered the cafe, the buzz that dominated the environment ceased instantly. Dozens of eyes followed him as he walked towards the table where Ethan was sitting. There was no longer the powerful CEO in his walk, just a nervous father. Approaching his son. "May I?" he asked, indicating the empty chair. Ethan nodded silently. Samantha discreetly moved away, giving them privacy but staying nearby as a silent guardian of that moment. "Did you watch?" asked Jonathan, his voice softer than Ethan had ever heard. "The whole world watched," replied Ethan, a nervous half-smile on his lips. "You just set the financial market on fire." "It was about time some things caught fire," Jonathan shrugged, a surprisingly casual gesture for someone always so controlled. 16 years building an empire, and only today did I understand that I was building the wrong walls. A silence settled between them, no longer laden with resentment as before, but full of unspoken possibilities. "Your grandmother, Jonathan," began hesitantly. "Does she still make that cornbread?" Ethan looked at his father in surprise. "How do you know about Grandma's cornbread?" "Your mother always said it was the best bread in the world." A nostalgic smile appeared on his face. "In the first months of pregnancy, she made me drive 2 hours just to get a piece." "She still makes it," replied Ethan, feeling something warm grow in his chest. "Every Sunday." "Ethan," Jonathan leaned forward, his restless hands on the table. "I know 16 years can't be erased with a speech or an apology. I'm not asking you to accept me as a father immediately. Just give me a chance to try to fix things at your pace, your way." Before Ethan could respond, a group of reporters invaded the cafe, cameras in hand. Flashes began to fire, questions were shouted from all directions. "Mr. Reed, have the shareholders already made a statement?" "Ethan, how does it feel to be the heir to Reed Tech?" "Is the merger definitely cancelled?" Jonathan quickly stood up, placing himself between the cameras and his son in an instinctively protective gesture. "Gentlemen, please, this is a private moment." "Private?" shouted one of the reporters. "You just made one of the most public announcements in American corporate history." It was then that Ethan also stood up, surprising everyone. "Hey, Dad," he called, the word dad coming out naturally for the first time. "How about that cornbread now?" Jonathan looked at his son, immediately understanding. "Jessica," he called his assistant, who was already approaching to control the situation. Cancel all appointments. I'm going on a trip. Where to, sir? She asked, although her smile indicated she already knew the answer. Home, he replied for the first time in years, feeling that the word had true meaning. As father and son left the convention center through the back exit, reporters were held back by security. Samantha watched the scene with satisfaction, typing a message to Mrs. Rose. Prepare the bread, they're on their way. In the car, during the journey back to the small Midwest town, Ethan noticed that his father was no longer wearing the gold watch. In its place, there was only the lighter mark on the skin, like a reminder of what had been left behind. You know, said Jonathan, breaking a comfortable silence, your mother always said that some journeys aren't measured in miles, but in courage. And this journey? Asked Ethan, watching the landscape gradually change from the big city to the countryside. This one, smiled Jonathan, is being measured in slices of cornbread. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. In Boston, headlines continued to be written, stocks continued to fluctuate, and speculations didn't stop arising. But on that road, inside that car, father and son began to write their own story, no longer in press releases or corporate reports, but in small moments, hesitant words and shy smiles that, little by little, began to fill 16 years of emptiness. The aroma of cornbread filled Mrs. Rose's house when the car pulled up in front of the gate. The sun had already set, and the porch lights softly illuminated the well-tended garden. For Jonathan, it was like going back in time. The house remained exactly as he remembered from his few visits during his relationship with Sarah. Things never change, he murmured, observing the orchid pots that Mrs. Rose still kept on the porch. Ethan opened the gate, the familiar creak of the hinge sounding like a welcome song. At the door, Mrs. Rose waited, her hands intertwined in front of her body in a nervous gesture that Ethan knew well. Mrs. Rose, Jonathan approached, his voice laden with contained emotion. It's been a long time. 16 years, 2 months and 15 days, she replied, her voice firm but not hostile. But who's counting? A tense silence settled, broken only by the distant sound of crickets in the garden. It was then that Mrs. Rose opened a tired smile. The bread is cooling. Come in, before it gets cold completely. The kitchen was the heart of the home, as it always had been. The solid wood table, covered with a floral tablecloth, seemed small for the historic moment it was about to witness. The bread rested in the center, its aroma evoking memories in Jonathan that he thought he had buried long ago. You still use the pan that Sarah gave as a gift? He asked, recognizing the characteristic shape of the bread. Mrs. Rose paused in the middle of getting the plates, surprised that he remembered such a detail. I do, she answered simply, but her eyes softened a little. Meanwhile, in the big city, the corporate world was still buzzing with the day's events. Jonathan's cell phone wouldn't stop vibrating with calls and messages, all carefully ignored. Jessica, his faithful assistant, had taken control of the situation, issuing an official statement explaining the strategic pause in merger negotiations. Your usual coffee, Jonathan? Asked Mrs. Rose, already moving towards the stove. Actually, he hesitated, I still have that cup, the one with the butterfly. Ethan watched curiously as his grandmother opened a specific cabinet and took out an old cup with a hand-painted blue butterfly. The piece seemed out of place among the simple crockery of the house. Your mother painted it, Mrs. Rose explained to Ethan. It was a hobby of hers, painting porcelain. This was the first piece she made. Jonathan held the cup carefully as if it were made of the most precious crystal. She had talent, he said softly. She always did. She did indeed, agreed Mrs. Rose, pouring the coffee. Ethan inherited that from her. Show him your drawings, son. Ethan blushed slightly. Grandma, now's not the time. It's the perfect time, she interrupted, already heading to the living room to fetch her grandson's sketchbook. Alone in the kitchen for a moment, father and son found themselves in a less tense silence than before. Jonathan observed the cup, in his hands, lost in thought. Why did you keep the cup? Ethan finally asked. Because, Jonathan took a deep breath. It was a promise. Sarah gave it to me the day she told me about the pregnancy. She said it was the beginning of our collection. of special moments. Before Ethan could respond, Mrs. Rose returned with a worn sketchbook. "Look here," she said, opening to a specific page, just like his mother. Jonathan examined the drawings with genuine interest. They were sketches of people, places, moments of daily life captured with surprising sensitivity. On one of the pages, he recognized his own face, probably drawn from a newspaper photo. "You have a gift," he said, his voice choked. "It's just a hobby," Ethan shrugged, embarrassed. "As it was for your mother," Jonathan closed the sketchbook carefully, "until I convinced her to prioritize a safer career." The silence that followed was heavy with regret. Mrs. Rose began to cut the bread, the sound of the knife against the pan filling the void. "It's never too late to fix things," she said, placing a generous slice on Jonathan's plate. "Even if it takes time." Outside, the sky was painted with stars, a view that Boston rarely offered. Through the kitchen window, they could see the jabuticaba trees that Sarah loved so much, now laden with fruit. "I remember when we planted these trees," Jonathan commented. "Sarah said she wanted our child to grow up climbing them." "And I did," smiled Ethan. "Broke my arm twice because of them." Jonathan visibly paled. "Twice?" "3 times, actually," corrected Mrs. Rose. "But the 3rd time was because of the neighbor's wall." Ethan's laughter filled the kitchen, and soon the three found themselves sharing stories. Some sweet, others bittersweet, all part of a puzzle that was slowly beginning to complete itself. It was past midnight when Olivia appeared at the back door, unable to contain her curiosity about the day's events. She found a scene she never would have imagined, her best friend playing cards with his billionaire father and grandmother, all with cornbread crumbs at the corners of their mouths. "Come in, girl," called Mrs. Rose. "There's still bread left." At the kitchen table, among playing cards and shared stories, something new began to form. It wasn't perfect. There were still many wounds to heal, many bridges to build. But it was a beginning. "You know," said Jonathan, watching Ethan shuffle the cards with the same concentration Sarah used to have, "your mother always said that family is like cornbread." "How so?" asked Ethan, dealing the cards. "It needs time, patience, and the right ingredients, but mainly," he smiled, picking up his cards, "it needs love to turn out right." Mrs. Rose served another round of coffee in the cups, including the one with the blue butterfly that now seemed to have found its way back to the table. Outside, the stars continued to shine over the small Midwest town, silent witnesses to a family that was finally beginning to reconnect. 3 months had passed since the night of the cornbread. The small Midwest town continued its quiet rhythm, although now and then an imported car would draw attention when parking in front of Mrs. Rose's house. Her garden, always impeccable, now boasted new species of orchids, a gift from Jonathan on one of his weekly visits. At the diner where Ethan still worked some shifts, now by choice, Olivia was organizing a small exhibition. Ethan's drawings, once hidden in worn notebooks, now occupied the walls of the establishment, transforming the space into an improvised art gallery. "I still can't believe you convinced the owner to do this," said Ethan, helping his friend adjust the lighting. "Actually," smiled Olivia, "it was your dad's idea." Jonathan had discovered his son's talent for art, not just in the drawings, but also in his unique vision of the world. In recent weeks, father and son had developed a ritual of sitting on Mrs. Rose's porch on Sundays, sharing stories and sketches. "You know," said Jonathan during one of these encounters, "Reed Tech has a design department that—" "Dad," Ethan gently interrupted, the word dad now coming out naturally. "I appreciate the offer, but I need to find my own path." Jonathan smiled, proud of his son's independence. It was one of the many lessons he was learning. Love didn't mean control, and supporting didn't always mean interfering. The merger with the Europeans, which seemed so crucial 3 months ago, had been renegotiated on new terms. The story of the CEO who chose family over business had surprisingly strengthened Reed Tech's image. It humanized the brand, as the marketing consultant said. But the most significant change wasn't in the stock numbers or newspaper headlines. It was in the small moments. Jonathan learning to make coffee in Mrs. Rose's old coffee maker, Ethan teaching his father how to use Instagram filters, the three of them sharing stories about Sarah on Friday nights. On one of these nights, Mrs. Rose surprised everyone by bringing a dusty box from the attic. Inside were dozens of letters, photos, and mementos that Sarah had left behind. "Your mother," she explained to Ethan, "wanted you to know the whole story one day, not just the sad parts, but the happy ones too." Among the memories, they found the first flyer from Jonathan's computer store, designed by Sarah. On the back was a handwritten message. "To my future billionaire, don't forget where we started. With love, S." Jonathan held the paper with trembling hands. "I forgot," he admitted. "For a long time, I forgot everything that really mattered." "But you remembered." "In time," replied Ethan, placing his hand on his father's shoulder. On the morning of the exhibition at the diner, the small town seemed to be in a festive mood. It wasn't every day that the CEO of one of the country's largest tech companies showed up for a local event, but Jonathan wasn't there as an executive. He was there as a father, proudly helping to organize his son's drawings. "This one," he said, pointing to a particular sketch, "reminds me of your mother." It was a drawing of the old computer store, recreated from old photos. Ethan had captured not just the place, but the feeling, the hope, the dreams, the love that existed before money and power entered the scene. Jessica, who had come officially representing Reed Tech, observed her boss with a smile. In recent months, she had witnessed a remarkable transformation in Jonathan. He was still the brilliant CEO he had always been, but now there was something more. A humanity that made his decisions wiser, his relationships more genuine. "The second quarter reports have arrived," she commented discreetly during the exhibition. "They can wait until Monday," replied Jonathan, without taking his eyes off a new visitor entering the diner, Samantha Davis. "I came to see if the happy ending I helped build is still standing," she joked, hugging Ethan. "Ending?" laughed Mrs. Rose, who was serving her famous cornbread to the guests. "This is just the beginning." And it was true. Their story, father, son, grandmother, was just beginning to be written. It wasn't a perfect story, for sure. There were still moments of discomfort, difficult conversations, and wounds that needed time to heal completely. But it was real. It was theirs. At the end of the afternoon, when most of the guests had already left, Ethan found his father sitting on the curb in front of the diner, watching the sunset. "You know what I miss most about that time at the store?" asked Jonathan. "What?" "The simplicity. I thought I needed to build an empire to be someone. It took me 16 years to understand that I already was someone. I was your father." Ethan sat down beside him, sharing the moment in silence. In Jonathan's pocket, the old gold watch remained stored, no longer as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of the time he had almost lost forever. "And you know what I discovered?" continued Jonathan. "That sometimes we need to lose something to understand its true value. But if we're lucky, very lucky, we get a second chance." From inside the diner came the sound of Mrs. Rose and Olivia's laughter, the aroma of fresh coffee and cornbread. It was a simple moment, ordinary even, but for father and son sitting on that small-town curb, it was extraordinary in its simplicity. "Dad," called Ethan. "Yes?" "Thank you for choosing to stay." Jonathan smiled, feeling the last rays of sun on his face. "Thank you for giving me reasons to stay." The day was ending in the small Midwest town, but for the Reed Parker family, it was just the beginning of a new story. A story no longer about corporate empires or billion-dollar fortunes, but about something much more valuable, the time recovered between father and son. And somewhere Sarah smiled, knowing that her last wish had come true. Her family was finally complete. Dear listeners, we hope that Jonathan and Ethan's journey has touched your hearts. For more stories that explore the deep bonds between parents and children, the choices we make, and the second chances that life offers us, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Leave your comments telling us where you're watching from and sharing your own stories of reconciliation and new beginnings. After all, as we learned from Jonathan and Ethan, it's never too late to reconnect the ties that truly matter.